Good afternoon. Nice to see you all. Welcome back. Welcome to part two of the video tutorial lesson on Matthew Arnold's Dover Beach. In last lesson, the last lesson I introduced you to Matthew Arnold. We read through the poem, and we uh, explored the first stanza, and I set you some comprehension questions to answer as a consolidate task at the end of the lesson. In this lesson, we're going to look at stanza 2 and stanza 3 and stanza 4. So we're going to try and get through the entire poem in this part of the lesson. So just to begin the lesson, can I get you to read through your notes, read through your independent task from last lesson, and read through the poem as a starter activity. So please pause the video and do those things that I just said. So read through the poem, read through your notes, read through your independent task, just to familiarise yourself with the content. So please pause the video. Welcome back. Here is the summary of the poem, and again I'll let you have some time to read through that again, just to again familiarise yourself with the content. So I'm actually going to read from the beginning, the kind of midway through the last stanza, the previous stanza, because this stanza does not make sense as a standalone. It's very much interrelated, interlinked with the content in stanza 1. So I'm going to go from the exclamatory sentence of listen. So I've just moved my screen down. So listen, you can hear the grating roar of pebbles which the waves draw back and fling at their return up the high strand. Begin and cease, and then begin again, with tremulous cadence slow, and bring the eternal note of sadness in. Sophocles long ago heard it on the Aegean, and it brought into his mind the turbid ebb and flow of human misery. We find also in the sound a thought, hearing it by this distant northern sea. Okay, so it's obviously worth deconstructing the stanza, especially the references that might be confusing to Sophocles and the Aegean. So we've got this allusion we need to understand. And some of the vocabulary is quite difficult, so turbid and ebb we'll go through as well. So let's explain the first allusion, and the allusion to Sophocles. And Sophocles is on your screen here. He's a Greek tragedian, which means that he's a writer of tragedy plays. And he has 7 surviving works, including Oedipus Rex, Electra, and Antigone. All 3 are I mean, those are 3 of the 7, but those are 3 phenomenal plays, all defined as tragedies. So all plays that have a kind of tragic ending and have a plot that revolves around a tragic hero, a bit like Richard III or Macbeth, if you're watching the Macbeth lessons as well. So Sophocles is a tragic playwright. He's living in Attica during the 5th century BC, and we'll talk about why Arnold makes reference to Sophocles. But it does help us to explain the second word, which we may not have known, which is the Aegean. And the Aegean is a sea that surrounds lots of the Greek islands, and itself is linked with tragedy. So two references that are both linked to tragedy. I'll explain why the Aegean is in a second, but Sophocles, the writer of some of the most famous tragic plays of history, and also an artist, just like Matthew Arnold, and then the Aegean, which I'll explain why that might be a reference to tragedy as well. So this is an artist's illustration of the origin story of the Aegean Sea and why it's called the Aegean Sea. And I'll go through it quite quickly. It's an interesting story. In the story, the man pictured on the cliff here is King Aegeus, and he's waiting for his son Theseus to return from his adventures. Theseus, who has been away on several adventures, and Theseus has an agreement with his father that when he returns, he's to change the colours of the ship to white, I think it is, because the black would mean that if he hadn't changed the colours of the ship, the black would mean that he was dead. So it would be a symbol of grief, in a sense. And Theseus in the myth, he forgets to change the sails. So he forgets to change the sails from black to, I think it was supposed to be white. And Aegeus here, who stood on the cliff edge waiting for his son to return, he sees the ship coming in to harbour, sees that its sails are black, and in an act of Greek tragedy and grief, he hurls himself into the sea, and henceforth the sea is known as the Aegean Sea. So I think Arnold is kind of cleverly referring to two different ideas and different aspects of tragedy here. One, the playwright and the artist Sophocles, and secondly, Aegeus, the father of Theseus. So let's take a closer look now at this and try and make sense of this stanza. So it only makes sense if we talk about the sound of the eternal sadness that's been brought in by the waves, and the sound has seemingly triggered something in the poet. It's reminded him of something. It's reminded him, he says, of the sound that the cadence or the sound or the note that Sophocles long ago heard. Okay, so there's a connection, we could say, between the poets across a different age. So I would say arguably that this gap between stanza 1 and stanza 2 represents a temporal shift in time, and a kind of a link or a connection between the two artists. Arnold in England at Dover Beach has heard this sound, a sound that he associates with human misery and sadness, and that connects him to the artist Sophocles, who heard the same sound long ago on the Aegean. And this is obviously an imaginative leap as well between the two artists, because of course, Arnold is only merely speculating and imagining the sound that Sophocles himself must have heard, and he says it must be the same sound that Sophocles heard in the Aegean that brought into his mind, and again it's an imaginative leap here, the turbid ebb and flow of human misery. And we finally understand, just going back to this line here, the eternal note of sadness, we finally understand why it's an eternal note of sadness and what that metaphor meant in the first place, this eternal note of sadness. And this eternal note of sadness represents, I'll go for metaphor again, represents to Arnold's mind and to Sophocles' mind the experience of human misery, the fact that it is a turbid ebb and flow. And this is a very important metaphor. So the turbid just means a kind of cloudy coloured, dirty, cloudy, opaque, kind of not transparent colour. It's used as an adjective. And in his mind, the ebb and flow is the description of the waves coming in and then retreating. Yeah. So we've got this idea of the turbid ebb and flow of human misery. It's a powerful metaphor. So it's the idea that human misery, like the waves in the sea, will retreat and come back, retreat and come back, retreat and come back. And it gives you this idea of a cycle of human suffering. That's I think the idea behind this metaphor, and this idea that Arnold has this connection to another artist, in that he's noticed that the sea imitates the idea of human suffering and the cyclical nature of human suffering, how it retreats and comes back, retreats and comes back. And importantly, the thoughts that he hears in the sound, and he's kind of mixing things together here, sounds and thoughts. The thought that he hears, I would say, is a realization, and that is that human misery is at the center of existence. That in a kind of almost like a Buddhist-like way, he sees suffering as being central to existence. So suffering and misery is central to existence. Hearing it by this distant northern sea, he goes on to say, the poet goes on to write, and it's again about this connection. Sophocles in the past tense heard the sound, this eternal note, and there's this lovely use of present continuous. That just means it's still happening. So there's a gerund, an ing, and Arnold is hearing it. So that's a lovely connection between the two artists. Sophocles heard it, Arnold's hearing it by this distant northern sea. And although there's a disconnect in terms of time, and although they are separated by both time and space in terms of geography, remember Arnold is, this should be capitalized really, Arnold is stood by the northern sea looking out at France, whereas Sophocles was on the Aegean. So they, even though they're looking at two different oceans, two different seas, two different lands, there's a connection between the two artists, I would argue. It's about how they've both realised that there is a thought conveyed in the sound of the waves, and that is the sound of human suffering. And I would say it then goes on to spark in the poet a series of almost of rumination, of meditations. And this poem becomes increasingly a meditation on the nature of human misery, the nature of human suffering, and why it's at the core of human existence. So it's quite a powerful philosophical work. I think we can see that this small second stanza is actually packed with ideas, packed with images. And I think at the heart of it is that image of the ebb and flow. And if we can imagine the kind of waves constantly coming in, and that metaphor really works and elevates the poem, I think. So, time for a checkpoint. Okay, so this marks the point in the video where I'd like you to pause the video to answer these questions on your screen in full sentences, please. Make sure you read through your notes and your annotations first if you need to, and read through sections of the poem again if you need to. And I'll see you afterwards. The timings are on the screen, so I shouldn't see you before then. Please pause the video. Welcome back. We now move on to stanza number 3. And I told you that the last line, or the last stanza rather, kind of shifts the poem and causes the poet to deliver a meditation. And we'll look at what he meditates upon and what he thinks about, what he ruminates about in this stanza. So I'll read the stanza first, like we did last time, and then we'll go through it in more detail. The sea of faith was once, too, at the full and round earth's shore. Lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled, but now I only hear its melancholy, long withdrawing roar, retreating to the breath of the night wind, down the vast edges drear and naked shingles of the world. I will pause there. So it's quite, I think, firstly we can notice it's a pretty dramatic shift in terms of the atmosphere of the poem. It's much more dark, it's much more brooding than it was earlier. Think back to those joyous exclamatory sentences. That seemed a long time ago. So, stanza 2 begins with this powerful metaphor, which is just as important, I think, as the metaphor of the turbid ebb and flow of human misery. And I think this metaphor is the kind of starting point of his philosophical musings, his thoughts about this sound that he's heard, this eternal note of sadness. And he says that the sea of faith was once around the earth's shore, and he compares it to a girdle. So this idea that faith and an overwhelming amount of it's it's an interesting metaphor, the sea of faith. This idea that faith, religious belief, used to encircle the world is what he means. So I would argue that the meaning of the metaphor, and I'm sure there are many interpretations that you could make as well, but the meaning of the metaphor for me seems to be about the idea of religious belief fading in modern times. So the idea of a rising secular society, and the poet, in my mind, appears to be lamenting or grieving this change in humanity. The fact that he sees the modern world as becoming increasingly distant from God, increasingly scientific, increasingly rational, increasingly secular, and distant from religion. So the sea of faith was once too at the full and round earth's shore. And I think he's thinking back to Sophocles' time, going back all the way to stanza 2, and how Sophocles would have believed in the Olympian gods, and how religion played such a central role in ancient Greek times. So let's just quickly go over what's changed. the beauty of the scene and the sights and the sounds of the sea, that's not changed since Sophocles' time. So I still think there's beauty in the world, according to Arnold. He can still see beauty in it. However, the beauty now has changed, and there's a sadness in the beauty that he sees, which he links to the loss of faith. This idea that the sea of faith is no more, I would argue. So it's really becomes quite a spiritual poem at this point. It's quite a meditative, spiritual poem that is exploring the relationship between man and religion. However, you'll notice that the other shift you notice is from the love poem to the fact that now it's become a more of a kind of philosophical poem. The romantic element seems to have disappeared. So that's another shift we should notice. The fact that it went from romance and it kind of shifted to being philosophical is an interesting shift. So, going back to this image, the sea of faith was once too at the full and round earth's shore. He then compares it to this idea, lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled. And it's a really lovely image of this girdle. It's kind of a bit like a, a girdle is a bit like a belt that is wrapped around something. And this idea that the sea of faith used to be universal. So he's talking about how religion was universal, how it created maybe a moral universe that everyone followed. And he's sad that that's disappeared. So once again, you have this obsession in this poem with the past against the modern, and I think that's a key theme in this poem: the idea of the past and the kind of sadness of the modern and the changes that have taken place. We then have that shift. He says, well, you used to have this image of the bright girdle furled around the world, the sea of faith, but he says, now I only hear its melancholy, long, withdrawing roar. And I love this line because I think, it's because of the caesura, the fact that you're forced as a reader to pause and to take in these adjectives and to think about what he's trying to express. It's quite difficult to decipher exactly what he's expressing here. But he clearly is, again, there's this idea of lamentation, of grieving. He says, I can only hear now the melancholy, the depressing, long, withdrawing roar. The sound that he heard at the beginning, remember that roar sound was the roar of the waves coming in. And this time the waves are retreating and they're going away. So the idea of the receding waves is troubling to the poet. And again, let's think about why that might be. Remember, he described it as a sea of faith. So if faith is receding, that means it's going away. And again, this might bring back the theme of modernity and modern life and the tension between modernity and religious belief, arguably. I mean, I'm sure you all have your own interpretations. But he then emphasizes that point, retreating. So first it was withdrawing, now it's retreating. Notice the use of verbs here. Retreating to the breath of the night wind, down the vast edges drear and naked shingles of the world. So he personifies the night wind's breath. And again, it's like we talked about how the waves come forward and then retreat. The breath is similar because you inhale and you exhale. And he compares the breath of religion being inhaled, so it gets sucked back in again, as it were. So it goes away again. So there's quite a few references here to the idea of things receding, things going away, things disappearing. And the thing that's disappearing, I think, is faith. I think he's seeing a world that is no longer as pious as it used to be. It's a world that's far more secular, and also, more reliant on technology and more rash and more a society that, the Victorian period was much more interested, arguably, in theories like Darwin's evolution or the advancements in science and technology that were taking place. And so I think he's troubled by scientific advancements. That's how I'll put it. He's troubled by this scientific advancement. He thinks that science and these new theories might provoke a break from religious belief. So we've got this beautiful image of the night wind retreating as well, down the vast edges drear and naked shingles of the world. And he takes this idea of this retreating figure, this idea of the figure moving away, disappearing down the vast edges. Again, this idea of the scale is important. He used that adjective earlier. Down the dreary vast edges and naked shingles of the world. And again, we've got this metaphor here of naked shingles of the world, because of course he's looking out on a shingle beach, but he's describing the world as a naked shingle beach here. And it reminds me of that metaphor of the sea of faith. So he's kind of juxtaposed those two things. And the naked shingles of the world, for me, again, the stones and the pebbles represent an emptiness, a despair, the hard, cold truth. Perhaps the shingles. Think about the feel of a pebble on the beach in your hand that's wet from the waves. It's cold, it's barren, it's empty, and I think that's what he might be describing as a metaphor for the state of the world. State of the world. Okay, again, there were multiple other interpretations that you could have made. Let's take a pause and a checkpoint here. You've got my checkpoint marks here. And I would like you to pause the video and your questions will appear momentarily. Okay, your checkpoint is on the screen now. As always, please make sure you follow the timings. Make sure you write in full sentences, and please make sure you now pause the video, and I'll see you afterwards. See you soon. Welcome back. Welcome back. So this is our final stanza, stanza 4. But again, we're going to read through the stanza, and then we're going to go into it in a bit more detail, and then I'll set you some comprehension questions as a checkpoint. So I'll read it through first. Ah, love, let us be true to one another. For the world which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new, hath neither really joy, nor love, nor light, nor certitude, nor peace, nor help for pain. And we are here as on a darkening plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. So this is obviously the conclusion of the poem, and I think it's worth remembering where we started, because I think there's a cyclical aspect to this poem in terms of its nature and in terms of its form. And we started with this description of the view of Dover Beach and the description of the natural world and the inspiration that it provokes in the poet. And now we come to the resolution of the poem. I think it's worth remembering that image in mind, that we've been invited by Arnold to stand beside him and his lover and watch this view and take in the sights. So I spoke earlier about the absence of the lover from stanza 2, really, that they're not referred to again. He invites us and the lover to the window to watch out on the view, and then actually kind of forgets the romantic nature of the scene and kind of falls into dark thoughts and ruminations. And he kind of comes up for air here. Ah, love, you've got this utterance. Ah, love, let us be true to one another. And again, that we haven't seen an exclamation mark since stanza 1, I think. And again, it returns to this tone, this atmosphere of joy and this atmosphere of excitement. And remember, this is a poem composed during his honeymoon. So I think the stanzas 2 and 3 don't seem to convey the joy and the excitement you'd expect of a newlywed couple. And he's again directly addressing his lover. Our love, let us be true to one another. And that's the thesis, that's the central argument of this stanza. It's about the lovers being true to one another, being honest with one another, being open with one another, and being truthful to one another. And he introduces this core argument, this thesis here. And what he now does cleverly is he talks about why it's important that they are true to one another, and he relates it to the view in front of him. And what he does is he subverts the view in front of him, because before it inspired him with great joy, it inspired thoughts of romance, it inspired thoughts of awe and wonder at the beauty of the natural world. Now the meaning shifts. So, oh love, let us be true to one another, for the world. Okay, he's had a realization. For For the world, he says, which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new. Okay, so the key word is seems. So this is about how the world may appear to suggest one thing. This is about how the world maybe it appears to show one thing or to consist of one thing, but actually in reality it offers something different. So he's saying here, the world lies before us, and again that's kind of like the moon which was lying before him, before against this idea of the feminine figure in the poem is quite interesting. So the world which seems to lie before us, I'll just put P for personification, like a land of dreams. Okay, that's fairly obvious as a symbol. It represents the endless opportunities, endless possibilities, happiness, etc., etc. This idea of the land of dreams simile. So various, so beautiful, so new. And again, notice the use of caesura to pause us and the repetition of this word so and the adjectives. Various, which means I think diverse, I think he means by that. So it's a world that's full of abundance, full of diversity. It's a world that's full of beauty. It's a world that's new and changing. So all of these are obviously really positive adjectives with positive connotations. But remember that word seems. So the world seems to be like that, but he says hath really, and here's the realization, even though it may look alluring, it may appear to be enchanting, it may appear to compel you to make these positive these positive associations. It might try and fool you into thinking it's various, beautiful, and new. However, he then juxtaposes that. He then says, well, it may appear to be like that, but in actuality, there is neither joy, nor love, nor light. And actually, what's interesting is you would think he would have a mirror image. So you think there'd be three. You think it'd be various, joy, beautiful, love, new, light. But he actually goes further, and he lists 6. So he doubles the negatives. So they're actually double the number of negative things than there are positive things. So it's neither joyful, nor love, nor light, nor certitude, nor peace, nor help for pain. So, I mean, I'm sure you can make your own interpretations about this, but the world is joyless, it's loveless, it's dark, there's no certainty, so it's unstable, it's changing. That, for me, goes all the way back to the point of stanza 2 and 3 about the idea of the sea of faith. There's no peace, there's no help if you're in pain. So essentially, it's really juxtaposition, because he's juxtaposing this beautiful view that's in front of him, and he's come to the realization that in reality the world is not anywhere near as beautiful as it seems, and in actuality it's a hostile, barren, loveless place. So it's quite a dark realization that he's had. And let's remember the thesis of the stanza was, let us be true to one another. So it's about his love for his wife. So he's listing how negative the world is, how hostile it is to human beings, arguably, and arguably to all human beings. And he says, we are here on a darkling plain. And this is clearly a metaphor. Swept with confused alarms of struggles and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. And you've got this closing rhyming couplet, which gives this kind of sense of finality and resolution to the poem. But it's quite an ambiguous ending. It's quite vague, and I don't pretend to know the answer at all to this in terms of the deeper meaning. I think it's interesting that he compares himself and his wife, who are actually, remember, it literally stood by a window looking out on the view of Dover Beach. He says, no, we're not there. Even though we are there, we're not there. We're actually in a darkening plain, which means a plain is like a vast, empty, barren meadow. We're on this dark, colourless meadow, or not even, meadow is a too positive word. We're on this dark, colourless heath, or landscape. And I think it's an interesting example of kind of a metaphor that represents their isolation. My personal interpretation of this is that he's trying to imply that all that they have, himself and his wife, is one another. They don't have anything else. There's no other hope, there's no other joy, there's no other beauty in the world for them to look out for besides their own love. So you can interpret it as being quite a brooding line, or you could interpret it as being a celebration of the unique nature of their love. I think it's open-ended. I really do. I think it's quite difficult to pinpoint what he means. But he does, again, he goes back to this idea of his kind of concerns and fears about modernity compared to the past. He says, we're swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight. And the swept verb I think is really powerful, and that enjambment is powerful because we are literally swept along with it. The sweeping I think of this as the waves. So the waves from earlier in the poem have swept them along, and the sounds of the waves of struggle and flight. So he's again going back to, I think he's going back to that image of the waves flinging the pebbles on the shore and the waves retreating and coming back. So they're swept away with these sounds of struggle and flight, and the struggle and flight surely goes back to the human misery, I think. So that even though he's saying we're surrounded by human misery, we only have each other, and our love is all that we can rely on. Where ignorant armies clash by night, and they've got this kind of ominous ending to the poem. He's not, I don't think, expressing fears about an actual war. I think he might be referring to, the wars that took place during the ancient Greek period. He might be referring to war throughout humanity, and the idea that war lingers in the background of all ages in a sense. But where ignorant armies clash by night, I'm not sure if he's speaking metaphorically here about the army of the moderns and the army of scientists, the army of the secular versus the army of the religion. So maybe it's a reference to religion and science again, and his fears about the growing secularization of England. They're clashing by night. So there's this idea of this nocturnal fight between these two forces. So there's clearly conflict. I mean, that's the only thing I think we can definitely agree on, that there is conflict taking place, and that they are being swept away in this conflict. And I think you need to decide what the conflict is between. Is he referring to the cycle of human misery? Is he referring to human violence? I think it's really up to you in your interpretations. So that marks the end of the poem. That final full stop gives us our sense of resolution. And we've come to the end of stanza 4. On your screen, there are going to be some questions on stanza 4, and then there'll be a final consolidate task. So please look out for both of those and complete both of those tasks first. Let's have a look at the first checkpoint, which is on stanza 4. So please make sure you write in full sentences, and please make sure you pause the video before, in order to write down the questions and in order to take your time to think about the answers. And I'll see you shortly. Please follow the timings as well. Welcome back. I'd like to explain your final consolidate task to kind of cement your understanding of this poem. So you've got 6 stars. Each star has a different topic in the middle, and each star has at minimum 5 ideas that you have to make. So you imagine that each of those points is an arrow. So for each one, for example, for atmosphere, you need to have 5 ideas about the atmosphere throughout the poem. So you might start off with the first star by talking about the atmosphere of jubilation or ecstasy at the beginning of the poem, and then mark how it shifts throughout. Similar with the themes, you might notice one of the themes was fear of the modern, for example, and then you need 4 other themes as well. So this is essentially a review of the entire poem. It will take you some time. Feel free to use your notes, but I would suggest doing it afterwards once you've started doing it, once you've done it by from memory. So try and do it from memory first, and if needed, use your notes to help you complete the task. That should take you at least 10 to 15 minutes. And then you need to complete the independent tasks I've set alongside the Show My Homework quizzes. That's the end of today's lesson and the end of our lessons on Victorian poetry. Next lesson, we move on to the poetry of the First World War. So I'll see you next time. Stay safe and stay well.